Due Process, winner of 25 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2014 New York Emmys for our coverage of criminal justice and current affairs. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
Woodrow Wilson shows us that someone who supports democracy in so many arenas of his life can also be a racist.
Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, a father of the progressive movement, and a diehard racist. He brought his bias to New Jersey's prestige college, to the New Jersey State House, and to the White House. No wonder black campus activists want his name and his image purged from Princeton. That's next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding from the New Jersey State Bar Foundation and the PSEG Foundation, making things better in our communities.
A progressive on issues like child labor and women's suffrage. The president who said he'd make the world safe for democracy, conceived the League of Nations, won the Nobel Peace Prize. That may be the Woodrow Wilson you learned about in school. I'm Raymond Brown.
I'm Sondra King, and chances are you were not taught about the other Woodrow Wilson, who revered the Confederacy, admired the Klan, supported segregation, and brought Jim Crow to the federal civil service. That's the Wilson black students say should be purged from his pedestal at Princeton.
We're here! We've been here! We ain't leaving!
And they didn't leave Nassau Hall for 32 hours until the president agreed to at least consider their demands, even the purging of Woodrow Wilson.
Why Wilson? Well, because Wilson is definitely one of the most idolized figures on this campus. When you enter as a freshman, there's a play. A segment of that play honors Wilson, says, oh, what would Wilson do?
But it's some of what Wilson did as president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and president of the United States that's prompted protest from some black students and supporters on this prestige campus, where Wilson is an icon.
To have Woodrow Wilson's name plastered across buildings, to idolize him, to see him as a god on this campus, that is disgusting.
His name and image here are ubiquitous, especially at the world-renowned Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs.
I champion the students who took over Nassau Hall and who've raised this issue of Woodrow Wilson. And I think that we should remove all symbols and all names that uphold white supremacy and racism.
Consider these Wilson words.
The domestic slaves, at any rate, and almost all who were under the master's eye, were happy and well cared for.
Or his admiration for
a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country.
There is no shortage of shocking examples from this national symbol of progressive democracy.
Segregation is not a humiliation, but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen.
Woodrow Wilson shows us that someone who supports democracy in so many arenas of his life can also be a racist.
President Eisenhower said Woodrow Wilson had flawed characteristics. Those are not just flawed characteristics.
Not when they had direct destructive impact on real people's lives. Whether it was the prospective black students rejected by Princeton until the 1940s.
No Negro has ever applied for admission. and it seems unlikely that the question will ever assume practical form.
Or the black federal employees whose careers and livelihoods felt Wilson's racist policies firsthand.
In places where whites and blacks would work, they would raise like a screen or partition to separate the white and the black in the federal government of the United States.
In an op-ed in the New York Times, lawyer Gordon Davis, once New York City's Parks Commissioner, recounted the story of his own grandfather, a manager in the government printing office pre-Wilson.
He had spent his career in a time and place where, whatever was happening in the South, African Americans were able to get ahead. And then, suddenly, with Wilson's election, that all changed.
Along with the rest of the black federal workforce, John Abraham Davis was demoted, his salary cut in half.
He reversed decades of racial progress. In doing so, he ruined the lives of countless talented African Americans and their families.
Mike Brown! Say it again! Mike Brown!
Inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement,
Who built this place? We built this place! Who built this place? We built this place!
the Princeton protests reached beyond Wilson, targeting curriculum, campus culture, and the racism these students say is not entirely different than what Newark activist Larry Hamm found here more than 40 years ago.
When I first got to Princeton, I remember one of the first days, I'm talking about 71 now, you know, somebody in the cowardly way, they wouldn't stop and do it to my face, but they rolled by and hollered out nigger. You know, it existed when we were there in the 70s, and it exists today.
You don't understand that because you're white. Like, I'll just explicitly say that.
The students in the Black Justice League have issues on their mind. They have questions in mind that other people have not in the past brought with such ferocity to our thinking about Woodrow Wilson. Wilson existed, these events took place, and I think our job at a university is to keep tangling with them, keep wrestling with them.
And that includes pushback from another, mostly white student group, claiming acquiescence to Black Justice League demands would threaten academic independence and free speech at Princeton.
It's not for his flaws, but for his positive contributions that we are honoring him. And we are glad that there is more discussion about Woodrow Wilson's legacy. But the Black Justice League's demand to erase his name will give the impression of a university-sanctioned orthodoxy or taboo.
And so, on a campus whose last major protests were the sit-ins Larry Hamm organized 40 years ago against investment in apartheid South Africa, there is new activist expression and energy.
My hope is that the other demands that they raised for changes in curriculum and more professors of color and so on and so forth, the more structural kinds of demands, that hope they don't get lost in this big discussion about Woodrow Wilson.
We here! We here! We've been here! We've been here! We ain't leaving! We ain't leaving! We are loved! We are loved!
And the Princeton protests are just one expression of a resurgent black activism at colleges around the country. Calls for transparency and apology on early links to slavery, solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and insistence that racism remains a fact in the curricula and campus culture of even the most elite U.S. universities.
Is that true? And if it is, what makes the most moral and practical sense for addressing the campus twist on this age-old American dilemma? Woodrow Wilson is no stranger to Richard Roper. He earned a master's from the Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, where he worked for over 12 years, now a public policy consultant. Richard's also a member of the Rutgers Board of Governors. Jeremy Adelman, professor of history, former chair of the department and director of the Global History Lab at Princeton, recently wrote a piece for the Chronicle of Higher Education titled, "We're Having the Wrong Debate About Woodrow Wilson." Gentlemen, welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Jeremy, my first question is for you. I think it's fairly well established that Wilson is an icon at Princeton, and it's fairly well established that his attitudes on race were profoundly negative. And the result of those two things has caused students to say, let's change his iconic status. Now, I'm going to do something we never do, which is ask you two questions. First of all, can we persuade you to go either way on that issue? Because you've written an article where you say that's really not the right question.
Can I go either way on the issue? Well, you would have to persuade me. I am approaching this with an open mind, which means I'm open to all sides on this one. The piece that I wrote was really making the case for, let's say, a deprovincialized view of this debate. I think in the global age, we have to think of the United States as a society that's engaged in worldwide affairs, and that Woodrow Wilson, perhaps more than any other American leader, had a formative role in the making of the world. So let's expand the debate and let's think about the other forms of exclusion and inclusion that he was the architect of.
So is the black student position, Richard, a provincialized view since it affects or the image of a guy who was president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, president of the United States? Is it provincialized, as Jeremy suggests?
In the words of one of my former colleagues at the Woodrow Wilson School, Rufus Smiles, where you stand depends on where you sit. So I think that far from being provincial, this is a reflection of young people coming to terms with the realities that they confront as members of our society, the American community, who feel that in the absence of being involved in the decision-making process or contributing to the decision-making process, they've got to suffer the consequences of the decisions made by others. That's not provincial.
But, Richard, you were at Princeton for many years. Were you aware of this other Woodrow Wilson, and was it something as you entered the Wilson School every day that bothered you?
Yeah. When I enrolled at the Woodrow Wilson School as an MPA candidate in 1969, ages ago, I was somewhat familiar with Woodrow Wilson as a former president of the United States. I knew that there were some negative connotations associated with him and his attention to race. But I was more concerned at that time, as were most of the Woodrow Wilson School students then, about where the university got the money for the Woodrow Wilson School. The assumption was the CIA had advanced Princeton $62 million in order to establish this place.
Was it true?
No, it turned out to be false. It was not true. But that was the issue that confronted most of us as graduate students then. Over the years, however, more and more information became available to us about who this man was, what he represented. So when I returned to the Wilson School as an administrator, researcher, and a teacher, I had a much deeper sense of who he was. So therefore, whenever I, as an administrator at the university, entered Prospect House, which was at one time the president's home, I smiled because I knew that Woodrow Wilson was turning over in his grave, knowing that I was entering his home, not as a servant, but as a member of the university leadership.
But no one at that time, black students, were not raising this issue.
No, we were not raising that. That was not the issue for us. The issue for us in those days had to do with faculty, minority faculty, black faculty, more black students, a more active engagement by the university with the larger community, in particular Trenton.
Professor, one of the students mentioned the concept of orthodoxy. And I suppose that, although putting aside for the moment that a university ought to be a place where maybe there are no orthodoxies, there is not an orthodoxy when you hold out Wilson as an icon, when a school is named for him, when there are statuary dedicated to him. That's a form of orthodoxy. And to some extent, the black students are saying, we have to do away with orthodoxy. Now, I know given somebody who thinks in as complicated as terms as you would reject the concept of orthodoxy, but don't we always have some kind of orthodoxy? And isn't it appropriate to say, what are the messages we're sending?
I think we have them, and actually we often live by them. I think our job as intellectuals and what happens at the university is to interrogate them, to scrutinize them, to hold them up to the light, and to see what holds true, what changes with time. I mean, the fact is that Woodrow Wilson was iconic in one moment, and the set of issues that surrounded his name had one meaning, several decades ago, and has a completely different meaning. And I think that is a sign of a healthy important debate.
So you think the conversation is a positive one?
Yes, I think that what the students have ignited is a positive process for the university, for the country, and for the world at large.
But Jeremy, you are saying, I think, that Woodrow Wilson did some great things, and then there's the Woodrow Wilson that wasn't so great. But on something as serious as slavery, as segregating the federal workforce, can you just sort of say, well, we have to weigh the two? Or are there some things that are just so morally repugnant that you can't take a position that says, oh, let's keep this guy around because he did some good things?
Absolutely. And if I were open and we were involved in an argument, I would eventually, my priors would be to lean towards the cause of equity and justice, which would drive me to one side. But it doesn't mean that my mind is closed to hearing the arguments from the other side and potentially, being persuaded. I myself, right now, based on what I know, don't agree with that position.
Don't agree that Woodrow Wilson should be purged or should remain?
Well, I don't agree with the view that he represents something close to a godlike figure in American history, whether we roll him out as an icon of everything that's good about American values. I think that was Raymond's question, and I would say on that score, I much prefer the mixed version. And
does the mixed version allow his image and his name to remain?
Well, I think that's a discussion that the constituents associated with the university, have to have an honest, open debate about.
Tough decision, and
I think that's a very tough
argument to be having now. How's life on the campus?
Well, I mean, I'm on sabbatical, so I'm not in touch directly with the pulse. And it's a process that, in my view, has really just begun. I mean, the trustees committee is going to look into this and hopefully mobilize people to have an open exchange. And I think, I hope Richard would get involved in it.
So there are two sets of complex issues. One is, where in the hierarchy do you weigh the various things that Wilson did? My own bias would be that he's endorsing the great crime in American history and ought to be gone, but that's aside from it. And the other issue is one raised by our friend Larry Ham, Richard, which is that there are a range of other issues this brings forward, like how do we shape our curriculum and what does the university look like in terms of its faculty? Do those other issues, you think, get significantly into the mix when there is such a great paradigmatic or iconic question like his name and his statuary?
I think Larry raises a very good point, but I think at this moment in time, the issue has been raised and it has to be confronted. How we resolve it, as Jeremy has said, is a function of how that conversation plays out over time. I'm hopeful that that the larger community, that's not the community of color, but the larger community will recognize how this issue and issues like it impact the lives of people of color.
But to the extent that students are going to be involved in this issue, the body politic is debating some similar kinds of issues with, I would say, a lack of maturity and in-depth analysis, issues of race, xenophobia. So would you expect that an issue that has to involve students as a critical part is likely to play out in a more mature way than the body politic at large?
Well, right
Maybe
now,
you don't agree with my assumption about the public debate.
Yeah, I think the public debate has been constrained by the media, unfortunately, so that we have only a fraction of what's actually going on out there before us. So I'm of the view that what these young people are saying reflects the sentiment, if not a complete full awareness of the broader community of color, if you will, about how people of color ought to be recognized, treated, and included as a part of the society at large. And that just doesn't happen often. For these young people to bring this to the fore, not only with respect to minority faculty and other minority students, but this issue of symbols and how those symbols impact our lives on a daily basis. The Confederate flag in South Carolina, and how we had to address that. And once addressed, the larger society unfortunately had to be confronted with the murder of 9 people in a church to come to terms with that. But I think raising the issue is legitimate. How we address it the conversation is legitimate. Where we end up, we will determine whether that's legitimate in the long run.
Can I jump
Where
in
are you?
on?
Let me just ask
okay.
Richard where he is himself right now. You would tear it down?
I would remove the name, but that's not for me to decide. I have an opinion about this. I feel strongly that in weighing the scales, where I sit, it causes me to stand with the students in saying his name should be removed from the school.
Jeremy?
Well, I just wanted to jump in on what I think is a key word that Richard used, which is the word our or the we. And I think that's something that we have to talk about. So when I say deprovincialize the debate about Woodrow Wilson, what I mean is not that being provincial or being local is of less value, but that it's embedded in a broader global pattern of exclusion. And my job as a teacher of global history at Princeton is to say your sense of a past that's been manufactured to produce a certain iconic image is connected to a global process of exclusion that when Woodrow Wilson goes to Paris in 1919 left Africans off the table.
That's pretty complicated.
So why can't we bring these two together?
Because Du Bois meets him twice, first in domestic politics and then as part of a Pan-African
Du Bois
group
is
saying we don't want the
desperately trying to
mandate
meet
system.
him in Paris in 1919.
But do you fully expect that the community at large surrounding Princeton is going to be informed on every aspect of it so it's a
That's my
cosmopolitan
job.
and not a provincial debate?
Right, that's
so
our
we
job,
can hold
that's
you
your job,
accountable
that's what
for
we're
the
doing in the
quality of the
media,
debate
right?
at Princeton.
So if we're having the right debate,
That's what we're doing, right? We're raising the level of
what is the
discussion.
right debate?
Like, I think the debate can be held at many levels. When I watch footage of a student, my students, who feel that the story of their membership at Princeton University is not one that is reflected in the iconography around the university, I feel for that student. I think there is a local debate to be had, and I think there's a global one.
And you know, the students are going further than that. They're saying that in general, they feel that Princeton is not welcoming to them. They don't feel comfortable. They want some of their own space. They want curriculum change. They want a certain amount of re-education on issues of
including for faculty
of race, including for faculty. So how does that sit with you?
I welcome the debate. Again, I don't have strong priors. If my concern is about education first and foremost, then I want to always work on better strategies to be a better educator.
How's the administration doing so far in making this, to use a hackneyed phrase,
You
a
mean my boss?
teachable moment? Yes. But you have academic freedom and tenure. So
Just 2 minutes remaining.
as a teachable moment, to use a terrible cliche,
Yeah.
how's the university administration doing in making this into
I would say calling for an open discussion.
And having a really hard time.
Wow, it's uncomfortable, as you might imagine. Anytime we touch cherished symbols, it makes us feel uncomfortable. It should make us feel uncomfortable.
When you came to Princeton, did you feel uncomfortable? Forget about the Woodrow Wilson symbol. Did you feel, as a black student, that you were
That I
sidelined?
belonged? No. I mean, I think I felt intimidated by the environment. Remember, I'm coming out of Newark. This is 1969. Martin Luther King had been killed only a year or so before. Yeah, I felt intimidated by the environment. I thought that I was a part of an experiment, quite frankly, and that experiment was to provide the majority of students on the Princeton campus with an opportunity to interact as a part of their learning experience with black people who might at some point in time become players.
So
and
what the
therefore,
Supreme Court calls diversity and critical mass.
With 40 seconds remaining, I'm going to ask both of you quickly, are you surprised that black students say they feel uncomfortable in every way at Princeton, and are you?
I'm surprised that they, I am surprised that they still feel uncomfortable at Princeton in 2016. I would have assumed that by now the university would have gotten to the point where it could really make every student on campus
And Jeremy,
comfortable.
with 15 seconds left, let me give you the last word.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. There have been rumblings and there have been previous demonstrations about issues of inclusion and equality at the university. I think it's a process.
And it will be,
so I'm not surprised.
that will be the last word. for now, with our thanks to Jeremy Adelman and Richard Roper, because that's it for this edition of Due Process. But we'll be back next week and every week with more of the complex justice issues you're not likely to find elsewhere.
And for still more Due Process, visit us on Facebook or stop by our website at dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu. Tell us what you think. Check out our entire archive on demand. For Sandy, producer Tanya Bentley, and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
Many of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders themselves. And our own campus here at Princeton has such a deep history of liberty and slavery, liberty and racism being intertwined. In the summer of 1766, the president of this university, a man named Samuel Finley, planted 2 sycamore trees in front of his house, which still stands on our campus, to celebrate the overturning of the Stamp Act. He was a patriot. 2 months later, he died, and his human beings, his slaves, were sold in that house on our campus. So those trees that speak to the triumph of the American Revolution and to American freedom guarded a house where slaves were sold. That's the paradox, and it exists right here at Princeton.
Want even more insight on law and justice? Become a fan of Due Process on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and watch us on demand on YouTube.